Jer si milostiv i čovekoljubiv Bog i tebi slavu uznosimo, Otcu i Sinu i Svetome Duhu, sada i uvek i u vekove vekova.
In a world of shadows and secrets untold, where primeval stories make the brave go cold, mighty gods on high and realms below, whispers of legends that shape each soul. And nightmarish dreams, cryptids lurking, nothing's as it seems, giants walking, angels and demons fight, only truth can bring the light. Through the echoes of time, the tales unfold, mysteries arise as the prophecies are foretold, from valiant knights to buried treasure, this podcast brings nothing but pleasure. Yeah. Welcome to myth, mysteries and majesty. Study with us, don't be a travesty. Theology, mythology, fantasy and horror, dungeons and dragons, Skyrim and Mordor. And Mordor, powers haunt the evening, in gothic castles where they're screaming. Wizards cast spells in their towers tonight, exploiting enigmas hidden from our sight. Archaeologists make excavations deep of the ancient tombs where pharaohs sleep. In the dust of ages we chronicles keep, storytelling's power of monsters that creep. Mysteries and majesty is the place for you to learn about this haunted space. From scholarship to manuscripts of old, unlock the secrets of wisdom and gold.
Well, blessed Sunday, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode on your favorite 3M podcast. I said Friday because we just recently finished another episode when we were covering on the Skinwalker Ranch. I'm very honored, to be honest with all of you, to welcome for the first time ever Dr. Aaron Judkins, who is the archaeologist, who is an explorer, as he wrote on his Amazon page, and an author of a book that we'll be dissecting tonight. The book title is called Decoding Gobekli Tepe, Biblical Anatolia, and the Watchers. I have provided the Amazon link in this video's description, so please, if you can, support the work of Dr. Aaron Judkins and Dr. Judd Burton, who couldn't come with us tonight. So we're sending prayers and hopes of him recovering and maybe joining us in the future. When it comes to your spiritual, theological, and archaeological background, Dr. Judkins, what is it that you would like to share with the audience?
Well, hey, thanks for having me on your podcast, Myths, Mysteries, and Majesty. It's my honor to be on tonight with you and your audience. Well, my background is was raised as a Christian from an early age, and we went in between several different denominations, but had a strong upbringing as a Christian, and that always I think was always just a part of who I was. I never really had any kind of doubts about my faith until I was about 21. And I came to a crossroads in my life where I was kind of doing my own thing at the time, and I wanted to live this kind of rock and roll lifestyle. I was going to be a rock and roller. I had long hair. This is back in the 80s, and I just decided it was going to be much easier to do that than it was to try to, hold to a Christian life that I was failing at. And just very briefly, I'll give you this. But, I had, like I said, been raised in church all my life. My mother played the piano in the church. I played drums and I sang. And so music was a very, one of the first passions in my life. And it was at the age of 21 where I came in really late. And I had for several weeks been having these vivid nightmares that something terrible was going to happen to me, that I was dying in these dreams, and a number of things were happening. And I had one encounter that was not a dream. It was a vision, but it was the most terrifying event that ever happened to me in my life. And it was to the point where I saw an entity in my room. It was as tall as my ceiling. It was a blackness in the darkness, if I can put it that way. And I couldn't move. I couldn't scream, nothing. And for several weeks, I had been having dreams and encounters that were just terrifying me. And I wouldn't sleep with the light off for several weeks. And so I came home this one particular night, and I don't sleep very well with the light on. And so for several weeks, this has been happening. And I was kind of fed up, and I said, I am turning this stupid light off. I'm tired of sleeping with it. I'm tired of going through this. And as I put my head on the pillow, just very informally, just to myself really, but very quietly, I just said, Lord, if you're real, I have to know right now, because I can't continue to do this. And I closed my eyes. I turned off the light. I closed my eyes. And when I opened my eyes, there was a brilliant, radiant light in my room. It illuminated the entire room that I was in, from ceiling to floor, wall to wall. And I had one window that went to the outside, which was towards a neighbor's house at the time I lived at. And so I got up and I walked around in my room in this light. And I went to that window because I'm thinking, if there's a light coming, that's the only source it can come from. I went out, looked out the window. This was about just before 1:30 in the morning. Nobody was out there. There was, not a creature stirring, not even a mouse. It was just totally quiet. No light source from the outside. And I walked around in this light, and I sat down in my bed, and I was contemplating if I was dreaming. And I'm experiencing this light, and after a few minutes, it dissipated very gently. I'd never had any fear associated with this encounter. I felt such a peace, and a tangible peace and love in a way I'd never felt before. And I was contemplating and asking myself questions. Did I just see what I saw? And not audibly, but very quietly in the stillness of my heart, the Lord spoke to me, and he said, you just asked me for a sign, and I gave it to you. And I quickly found some pen and a paper, and I wrote down what had happened that night with the date, because that night changed me forever. So that's at the point, even though I was saved at a very early age, I had doubts later on in life, and the Lord, in a very tangible but immediate way, answered my prayer. That doesn't happen very often, and that has never happened since. But I've had my prayers answered, not in such an immediate way, but in other ways. And so for me, that really encouraged me in my faith, that this was not just something I was doing because my parents raised me this way, or because I was raised in the West in a Christian culture. This was real because the God of creation came down and met me where I was at in that moment and answered my prayer. So that's a longer answer to your question, but for me, this is a serious issue for me.
Thank you so much. That was encouraging and amazing, because as our title says, one of the topics and themes we cover on the podcast are strange stuff, mysteries, mythologies. So this fits perfectly into the overall, topic that we're trying to do on the channel. So I really appreciate you, sharing your personal story of how Jesus met you. That was amazing. I don't have a story like that, so I feel a little bit jealous. Like, God, what about me? But okay, I'll have discussion with God when I'm done with the podcast. That being said, what led you into the field of archaeology, and especially what led you and Dr. Judd Burton into, wanting to explore more Göbekli Tepe? As far as I know, you're the first Christian authors who wrote a book on this topic.
Right. Well, my interest in archaeology began very young because I had an interest in learning. I read books. I was a very avid reader of books at a young age. And in the summers, I would spend my time reading. I'd do a lot of other things too, like any normal kid. I was out fishing and hunting and riding my motorcycle. I was always outside. If I was inside, it's because the weather was bad or I was grounded. I was outside. But I did a lot of reading, and I was a fast reader. And I would, during the summer, I would go around and I would get pledges from people, and I would they would sponsor me. And I would say, look, I'm going to read 15 books this summer. And if you pledge whatever you wanted to, I used to take that money. I'd raise money for multiple sclerosis. And then I would, back in those days, you'd fill out a thing and then put it in the mail, and send it off. And then you could get, they would send you things. Usually I'd get science projects or little rockets or whatever. But that really caused me to be a very fast reader, and I could consume books pretty quickly. And then later on, that went from just an interest in fictional reading to reading about history. And my love for history really began when I was probably more towards in junior high. And I loved Native American history, and that's kind of where it started for me. But that interest in history then naturally led me into archaeology because I had a love for history. When I really became a student of the Bible, and I understood that there was more, more things in the Old Testament that was comparable to, if I could compare it to the movie The Lord of the Rings, there was a supernatural element in the Old Testament that I had never seen before. And that, as a student of the Bible, when I began to become a serious student of the Bible, I realized there was much more in the Old Testament than I had ever realized. One, I wasn't really even taught any of that in church. And two, here was a supernatural element, this unseen realm behind the scriptures that just opened the door to my understanding about the what was happening. And I got invited to go on an archaeological dig back in 2004. This is where we initially discovered the steps to the Pool of Siloam in Jerusalem, Israel. And then from there, I already had an interest in biblical archaeology, but that really solidified it going on that excavation in Israel. That made international news back in 2004. And from there, I really began a deep dive into biblical archaeology. And I realized that there was evidence that confirmed our faith in archaeology. And even outside the lands of the Bible, extra biblical archaeological evidence was confirming what the scriptures, either Old Testament or New Testament, had stated. People, places, names, dates, events were being confirmed in archaeology. And so I was very intrigued with that, because this is, a record of the past that's confirming what's been written in the historicity of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So at one point, I was asked to take a look at Göbekli Tepe. probably 6 years ago now. And I had knew about it, but I didn't really have an understanding of what Göbekli Tepe was about. I had heard about it, had seen some things, but didn't really take much interest in it because I was doing other things. And so I didn't really take a look at this until one of my followers who has followed my work, my archaeological work, and his name's Roger. And Roger, he said, you gotta take another look at this. And he prompted me many times. And it was finally on, after 3 or 4 times, I said, okay, let me just take another look at this and see what's going on. It already had something in my mind that I thought it was. And when I realized that my presupposition on that was wrong, I really began to do a deep dive on Göbekli Tepe.
Thank you for that. I only have one more question when it comes to the introduction, and I'll let Carey take over for the next segment. And my question is this, Dr. Judkins, why do you think that this topic would be important for us as Christians? Let's say a number of Christians is watching this episode either live or in the days and weeks to come. And let's say they're thinking, well, this is an ancient temple, has nothing to do with the Bible or with Christianity, or at least they think. What would be your answer to them?
Well, if you're a student of the Bible or a student of biblical archaeology or history, you would be, I think, intrigued to know what's happened at Göbekli Tepe, just like I was intrigued with the evidence coming out of the ground that confirmed the biblical historicity. Göbekli Tepe goes back to a very beginning point of our ancestry. And I'm not talking evolutionary ancestry. I'm talking about biblical ancestry. And Göbekli Tepe, towards that beginning, this is the area of the Fertile Crescent where an explosion of civilization happens. And if you understand what's happening at the very beginning, you understand that when Solomon says there's nothing new under the sun, it ties into what's happening today. Because I go back to the beginnings here at Göbekli Tepe and I show you what the people, I think, were doing at the site and why they were there. At least part of the answer is why would they have been in these enclosures? And it's very relevant actually to us today, because if you can understand the spiritual connections behind what they were doing there, you can understand that there's spiritual connections, those spiritual connections and themes that were being played out then are being played out now, even today. And so there's a spiritual component behind it, not just in the archaeology, but in actually how they were living and practicing. And so if you can understand that, you can get a better understanding of the very beginnings of Baal worship and this spiritual connection that they had when they lost the Garden of Eden. And these are people after the Tower of Babel who were just normal people, but they had begun to deify entities and objects in nature, and they were doing that for a specific reason. So I think it's very important, if you go back and you're a student in history or the Bible, as you said earlier, this is the first book about the site at Göbekli Tepe that brings a biblical perspective to the site.
All right, so you mentioned like the time period and things like that. Where would you situate Göbekli Tepe within the biblical narrative? You said after the Tower of Babel. So does it stretch a period of time?
It does. It's after the Tower of Babel, and there's reasons for that. I laid the foundation for all this in the book, but it's after the Tower of Babel. And one of the reasons is because I believe I've identified language at the site on the stones. It's a language called Anatolian hieroglyphics, but more specifically, it's Luwian logograms. And this is exactly what we're seeing on the stones at Göbekli Tepe. So it's after the Tower of Babel because the scattering has already happened. The languages have been confounded. And so if I'm right about the linguistic theory, going back to Anatolian hieroglyphics, this would definitely put it post Tower of Babel. But it's post flood. People ask me, is it before the flood? It's after the flood because the site is built with limestone. Limestone is a sedimentary rock. It's laid underwater, and so this is limestone post flood, post Tower of Babel site. But it would be probably several hundred years or several generations after the Tower of Babel. In the back of the book, I've spent months putting a chronology chart together, and I initially did it as just a visual reference to help me keep tabs with the timeline about where do you put Göbekli Tepe on the biblical timeline. And so it didn't really start out as something that was going to go in the book, but as over the months it began to grow, and I realized, well, there's more than one timeline here, because if you're using the Masoretic text, there's also the Septuagint timeline, which differs from the Masoretic text timeline. And so I thought, well, what does that timeline show? So I actually put both timelines in the back of the book. It's in a chronology chart that's visual that you can just simply look at and see. But surprisingly, no matter which timeline you're using, it's fairly close within each other. Probably more close than what people would realize.
Yeah. I mean, it's a little off, but they're not really that off, those two timelines.
Mm-mm.
So would you agree with the traditional dating of Göbekli Tepe?
That's a
in
great
scholarship?
question. Yeah, that's a great question. Look, we have a place for scholarship, and but scholarship, even in biblical archaeology or Near Eastern archaeology, most of the scholarships dating on a conventional timeline using evolutionary chronology, which pushes man back 500,000 years, pushes the age of the earth 4.6 billion years back, the universe 13 to 20 billion years back. Now, I don't believe in any of those long ages. I used to, and I was taught those ages. And even though I was a Christian, I was taught that. And so I just simply believed it because this is, what science was saying. What scientists were saying, that this was true. But a lot of assumptions have to be made to reach those conclusions. So there's an assumption which assumes eons and eons of time. And for instance, the time, a lot of people try to date things with say, carbon-14. Carbon-14, the further back in time you go with it, the more inaccurate it gets. Why? Because you have to make assumptions and variables into the equation. So you have to assume that there's a constant rate of decay, that there's no contamination. You have to assume other things, but those assumptions make the results unreliable. For instance, they've dated, they dated a seal that dies on the beach. They know the date when that thing died, and they go carbon-14 dated, and it comes out to be a couple of million years old. Well, that's an erroneous conclusion. So, and this is just one example. So carbon-14 is not that reliable. Some people want to use starlight for measuring time in the cosmos. again, you have to assume that the speed of light's been constant. And that assumption is not based on any empirical evidence. The speed of light's only been measured, I think, for 100 and maybe close to 180 years. I'd have to go back and look on that, but it's definitely less than 200 years. I want to say 170 something years that it's actually been measured. But before that, no one knows that the speed of light's been constant. Matter of fact, science is showing out that the speed of light is variable. So to assume that it was constant going back to just say 13 billion years, that is an assumption that most scientists, if you're an engineer and you need data, that is not data. That's an assumption. So again, there's variables to that of why I don't believe it's that old. But I do think it's old, but it's not as old as the conventional dating. So the conventional dating is 10,000 BC, roughly 9,600, 10,000 BC, which puts it back about 12,000 years old. But on a biblical timeline, if you're using the biblical timeline and you're not inserting the gap theory or a theistic evolutionary viewpoint on that, which could infer a gap of millions and millions of years in the scripture, then you don't really get millions of years. If you just run out those genealogies, they don't run out to millions of years. So that's just one example. So on the biblical timeline, the dating is much younger, but I give reasons why the dating is younger at Göbekli Tepe and not pre-pottery Neolithic A, which is Stone Age, which is before the invention of pottery. It looks old. It has an appearance of age. There is no pottery that they found yet as of this recording. It's mostly stone. It's all stone vessels. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's Stone Age. And there's reasons for that. But look, if you go back to this linguistic language theory, which is Luwian logograms, if that turns out to be Luwian logograms, they were a culture contemporaneous with the Hittites who lived in the Bronze Age, not in the Stone Age. So that puts it at a difference of, say, 7,000 years. Well, that 7,000 years actually doesn't exist there. So it's not, I don't think it's Stone Age. I think it's probably needs to be culturally redated, but I'll leave the scholars, to take a look at that. I'm simply introducing some new theories about the site and why it's important to Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for all of that. That's very helpful for our listeners. So as far as the location, where is it located and how does that relate to what we see in the Bible?
So this is in modern day Turkey, southeastern Turkey. It's biblical Anatolia or Asia Minor. So this is where we see Paul's missionary journeys going into Asia Minor. This is modern day Turkey. This is some of the first churches are founded in Turkey, in biblical Asia Minor, such as the Church of Ephesus would be one. This is where Paul writes the book of Ephesians to the church at Ephesus. So this is where we find Göbekli Tepe. It's on the southeast part of the country. It's situated along the plains of Haran on the highest point in that area on the Jermus mountain range. And there was plenty of wild wheat and barley and animals for them to hunt and eat. And so we see that the people at Göbekli Tepe made a home there and they actually lived at the site.
So, but what did they have, were they planting crops or were they doing other types of things there?
No, there's no evidence for them planting anything. Again, the grains were wild, which means that the seeds, just with any tiny movement, those seeds were small and they would fall out of the hull. It wasn't until people began to live a more sedentary life, and they cultivated those grains. And then over generations of cultivating and recultivating the grains, did the seed change to become a more stable seed. It grew a little bit larger, and it became more hardy. So it was more difficult to get the seed out of the flask. So they would use other things like threshing to remove the seed. But that was a result of cultivation and agriculture. So we see that they were not doing that at the Göbekli Tepe. They were simply just going out harvesting the wild wheat and the wild barley, and they would take it back. And there was evidence of stone grinding tools, mortars and pestles, that they would grind the grain into flour, and then evidence of hunting at the site, which they probably were hunting gazelles and antelope and auric, the ancient auric bulls. But there was plenty of wild game and food for them there at that site.
Awesome. But they weren't living at this site, right? This was more of a ritualistic kind of an area that they would.
They were living
do
at the
things
site. They were living at the site. It was initially thought that they came and left. But archaeological excavations have shown that there's rectangular structures that are adjacent to the circular enclosures, and this is where people lived. This was the everyday living homes of the people. As a matter of fact, they found 3 human burials under the floors at Göbekli Tepe. Now that's been established now, and I think there's probably going to be more to come. We know that the people of the Neolithic were called people. They were referred to as people of the bull, and we see that in neighboring Çatalhöyük, where some 10,000 people lived. On the conventional timeline, it's more around 8,000 BC. But there was about 10,000 people that lived there, and they lived at the site, and they buried their dead under the floor. So we're seeing some of this now at Göbekli Tepe, but they did live at the site.
Okay, so not having had the whole site actually excavated makes new findings really exciting, because that changes the paradigm, right? And when they're changing all of those things, then they get new ideas of what the significance of the structure is. And can you tell us a little bit about what the structure looks like and how it's designed?
Well, the site initially, they initially discovered the enclosures. They're circular oval enclosures. They took about 10 years to excavate enclosure D alone. They've excavated, I think, 5 or 6 of these now. There's 20 more of these enclosures buried under the dirt at Göbekli Tepe, which they have not excavated. So the site's about a 20-acre site. Only 5% of it has been excavated so far. But that's one of the enclosures there. This was reserved as a sacred space. And we see in enclosure D that there was a procession that you had to walk into the enclosure, and there was bench seating around it where you sat down. And in the center, there were 2 anthropomorphic stone pillars that were 18.5 foot tall. And again, this was reserved as sacred space. The rectangular structures that were adjacent to it, this is where they lived. They probably were very similar to the homes at Çatalhöyük, where you would enter and exit through the roof of your home. So they were subterranean structures, and this is a way that you could get out of the weather, the wind, the heat, etc. And we see evidence for plastering at Göbekli Tepe. So they plastered the floors and the walls, and this would also give it weatherproofing and probably some insulation as well.
Can you give us an idea of what the weather is like there? Is it hot? Is it humid? Do they have all of the seasons?
Well, they had all the seasons, sure. The weather was it was a lot more fertile back then. It's a lot different than it is now. They probably had a lot of access to game. We see evidence for this in the excavations there. We see evidence for a lot of animal bones, and we know that they were performing ritualistic feasting. So the environment was a lot different. It was very fertile, probably a lot more moisture and water at that time, and we see evidence for wild almonds and pistachios and things like this that they were eating as well. So we see that the environment was much different. It may have been it may have been a warmer climate than it is today. Is a very dry climate there. It's rocky soil, and it's probably a lot drier than it was then. But definitely the I think they had access to water that helped sustain them there, and this is evidence of of all the game and the animals that are there and the things that are growing. So the environment was much different back then.
Yeah, very cool. Very interesting to see the difference in how we live today versus how they did then, and all of the different climate aspects as well. Nico, did you want to go into the religious significance since we were just talking about the structure of it and all of that kind of thing?
Well, if I can just add one more note to what we were just talking about. The people that lived at the site had just come out of the Ice Age. This was probably within 500 years after the flood. The Ice Age didn't just immediately happen, although it did, but it didn't immediately happen after the flood. The flood was the mechanism for the Ice Age, and that probably took a couple of 100 years for that to fully hit and develop. You had a pole shift, a magnetic pole shift, and all these things happened, and it changed everything. And so now you have torrential rain coming down in the northern latitudes as ice and snow. For every foot of snow, it accumulates an inch of ice. And the magnetic poles shifted. We see volcanism throughout the region, basically all over the world, which is spewing sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide into the air, and this because of all these changes, it cools the environment down rapidly. It blocks out the sun. You have ash and all this stuff floating around in the air, and you have thousands of volcanoes probably going off, earthquakes, volcanism, so then you have a magnetic pole shift, which they have recorded in the tree rings that are fossilized in New Zealand. And we see that something happened after the flood. And then you have a sudden onset of the Ice Age. So as a result of the mechanism for the Ice Age being the flood, now you have anywhere from 700 to 1,000 years of an Ice Age. According to Michael Ord's model, there's about 700 years of an Ice Age. So it throws the temperatures down at least 30 degrees. The fresh water freezes over. The ocean levels drop between 200 and 400 feet. And now you're forced to survive again another calamity. So you got culturally reset when you come out of the flood. Now there's another cultural reset with this Ice Age. In the scientific terms, it's called the Younger Dryas event. I think it correlates exactly with the Ice Age. I know a lot of secular scientists will say, well, there were many. They say there was only 4, Ice Ages. Now they're saying there's probably up to 30 Ice Ages. but this was a result of one major ice age from the flood. And these people around the earth were forced to migrate. They were forced to move, forced to scatter. You're trying to follow the animals to survive. They were forced underground. It was a very difficult period of survival for the people on the earth. So when you get to Göbekli Tepe, there's an event called the Meltwater Pulse 1A event. And we see that there's a sudden warming of Earth's temperatures. It causes glaciers to melt. The sea levels come back up between 200 and 400 feet. And the people who had migrated and settled on those lower coastal areas got flooded out again when the sea levels came back up. This is why we have evidence of cultures that have been flooded off the coast of Malta, Alexandria, Egypt, Japan. We get the legends of Atlantis and things like this. This is because people built in those areas and then the floods came back up. So there was another regional flood at the Meltwater Pulse 1A event. And there was a sudden emergence of warming. And this is exactly where we see the people at Göbekli Tepe come out of. They're suddenly now able to come out. Things are flourishing again. Everything is coming back to normal. And so now we're seeing this is where the people at Göbekli Tepe are right after this event, right after the Meltwater Pulse 1A event, and then things start to flourish very rapidly. And so we see that the people are building again, and they're doing things at the site of Göbekli Tepe.
Oh, very good. Very exciting. So in your little chronology here that you've just laid out for us, you have the flood, then you have the Younger Dryas, which is after the flood. That's not connected to the flood in your chronology.
It's connected, but it's correlated with the Ice Age.
Okay. So you have the flood, the Younger Dryas, the Ice Age, and then the melting, and that's when Göbekli Tepe is flourishing. Yeah. And so we have Sean here who asked the question, so craftsmen built this site while having it to forage for food, but if they're doing it in the flourishing part of time where everything is now abundant and they're no longer having to suffer in trying to just make ends meet, then they're able to create these kinds of structures. Is that how you'd explain that?
Yes. Yeah. But what we see, again, going back to the conventional dating of Göbekli Tepe, which is conventionally dated to the Stone Age or pre-pottery Neolithic A, which means before the invention of pottery. Why? Because they don't find any evidence of pottery at the site. It's just stone vessels. So they put it at, 10,000 BC. But when you have people coming together in the Stone Age, building megalithic architecture that is not supposed to be there. This is baffled archaeologists when they discovered this. This megalithic architecture is not supposed to be there. Why? Because Stone Age people are not supposed to be capable of doing this. This shows a division of labor and organization and intelligence that they did not believe Stone Age man had. Yet we see megalithic architecture at the very beginning at Göbekli Tepe, which is something that's, again, not supposed to be there. And then we see religious ideology bringing the people together before the advent of agriculture, which is totally the opposite of what the textbooks teach in archaeology. So we see something, at least two very polar opposites at Göbekli Tepe. But yes, they were able to do these things, but religious ideology brought the people together first. They were there at the site because of the food and the wild game and the water and things like this. But why they built at Göbekli Tepe was the religious ideology. So they had everything that they needed to live at the site.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the Watchers have anything to do with their knowledge of building?
We get into that in the book. This is where Dr. Burton really gets into the book about the Watchers. There is a spiritual influence that's happening behind the scenes. Again, it goes back to the story of the Watchers, which is detailed in the first book of Enoch, that they interfered in the affairs of mankind, and they were teaching things and for forbidden knowledge such as the art of warfare and other things. But we see this influence at Göbekli Tepe because of the deification that they have put on nature. They have deified several things, but two things in particularly that they have deified was the image of the moon and the image of the bull. And we get into this in the book, but definitely there was a spiritual influence. And look, the people at Göbekli Tepe were just normal people, but they had a belief in their afterlife, like most ancients did. They believed that death was not the end, that you continued, and that there was things that they were trying to do to ensure that you and your loved ones made it in the afterlife. We see this in Egyptian history, where they would bury the pharaoh with all of his stuff because you're going to need it in the afterlife. They buried a whole ship in the sands. It was never used. They built it and just left it. This is why we find the rope and everything with that ship in the sands of Egypt. As a matter of fact, most of Egypt's they say only 1% of Egypt's been excavated. Most of it's under the sand, which I think is fascinating. But again, if you're the pharaoh in Egypt, not only you died, but all your servants and everything, most of everything that you have died along with you. And they all put you, because you need that stuff in the afterlife. You're going to need servants and food and your horses and everything else. So again, we see this Axis Mundi connection at Göbekli Tepe, where a belief in the afterlife has influenced, in particular, their ideology in the afterlife and how they lived there and what they were doing in the enclosures. And I think there's something in particular in these enclosures. I talk more about specifically about enclosure D, but it was something to do with the afterlife, and we're proposing that this is something called the regeneration theory.
All right, Nico, passing it to you for some questions there for that.
Yeah, I'm so glad, Dr. Judkins, that you mentioned, enclosure D, because in your work, you especially emphasize when it comes to enclosure D, pillar 18, which is called the Eastern Pillar, and then later pillar 31 or Western Pillar. So I was wondering, when it comes to pillar 18, here's the picture so the audience can see and enjoy. What is it so specific and so important for us to understand about this pillar?
Pillar 18 there is an enclosure D. This is one of two 18.5 foot tall anthropomorphic stone T-pillars. In the image that you're showing there, this is the image of a belt with a fox pelt loincloth in the front. You see hands and arms wrapping around the side with the hands coming towards the navel just above the belt line. And then on the side image, you'll see an image of the fox, and you'll see some decorations on the belt. Those are not decorations. I think that's language. So up towards the neck, at the very top of pillar 18, you'll see a crescent moon standard. You'll see a full disc above that, and above that, you'll see what looks like to be an English H. It's not an English H, but it's a logogram. And so this iconography is logograms, and this particular pillar we identify in the book. We identify both pillars in the book. And look, one of the reasons why you go into enclosure D, you enter through a procession. There's bench seating. These enclosures were probably roofed. They were not open to the sky originally. So when you walked in them, it would have been dark. And as you lit some torches in that enclosure for light, that would cast shadows on those massive 18.5 foot tall pillars. And that would cast shadows on the wall and the floor. And the people believed that a shadow represented that entity as the spiritual side of that entity or that being. So the shadow became alive. It made that entity alive because of the movements of the shadows that it created. And we see evidence, I think, of libations in the enclosures. In enclosure C, they found a shallow stone vessel with a grooved channel for draining perhaps blood. I'm not suggesting that they performed sacrifices there at Göbekli Tepe. There's no evidence for any sacrifice, either human or animal. I'm saying this was probably ritual libation ceremonies that they were performing in there. But it goes back to the regeneration theory and why they were presenting this ritualistic ceremonies in front of these two anthropomorphic images. Why? Because they have deified them. And so we see veneration of the ancestors, we see appeasement of the gods in for the netherworld, and we see this regeneration theory that is trying to regenerate your spirit back to the heavens. And this is part of what they were doing at Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah, thank you for that. While you're talking about the enclosure C, I tried to find it fast, and here it is, and we see these pillars in the shape of the letter T. But let me go back quickly to the previous link. So I would like you to tell us also about the pillar 31. What is so specific about one? And I'll scroll down so the audience can see the photos.
It's going to be hard to see pillar 31 at the top there. In the book, we have it in the book where you can see it. But pillar 31 at the very top where the neck is an image of a bull cranium bull. It's a skull and horns. This image of the bull cranium is also a logogram. And it's a representation of what this pillar means. There's no face on the pillars. They're faceless T pillars, but they're anthropomorphic, which means that they're human-like images with the arms and the hands coming around to the navel. We get into this in quite a detail in the book, but look, when you have this iconography that's established on these stones, it's not just art motifs. It is telling you important information. And in this particular instance, it's identifying who this pillar represents. And that's true.
I think his internet could be frozen. So hopefully he'll fix that issue.
Well, if you notice that the foxpelt loincloths are on both of the stones, and you have to ask, why would a faceless, T pillar need to be wearing a foxpelt loincloth? And this is a vital clue, it turns out, to identifying who these images are. To wear a foxpelt loincloth means that you have to cover your nakedness. And they're wearing a belt around their waist to do it, to hold that up. Now, it doesn't identify either male or female features. But again, the iconography can help us with establishing the identity of these stone pillars. So we see that they're wearing foxpelt loincloths. And in the book, I get into the anthropomorphic side of it, specifically relating to the arms. Because in the archaeological context, especially when we get into the Ugaritic text and references, arms signal divinity. And this is exactly the posture we see at Göbekli Tepe of these arms on both of these figures. And both, in other words, these arms, why they are anthropomorphic, they are telegraphing divinity status. And so there's a lot more going on with these particular stones than one realizes. And this is all detailed in the book and why we think we have identified both of these pillars.
Thank you so much for that info, Dr. Judkins. When it comes to, since we're talking about the stones and pillars, when it comes to the role of sacred stones throughout history, not just Göbekli Tepe, but in general in ancient Near East, what is it important for us to understand this cultural and historical context? So in that light, we can see Göbekli Tepe in a different light to help us understand how the ancients used to see these stones.
Well, there's a lot of evidence throughout ancient history of standing stones. In Europe, they were called menhirs. That's another way of saying long stones. We see standing stones throughout. There was some 50,000 standing stones across Europe alone back in the day. Now there's probably about 10,000. Also true across the Near and Middle East. There is evidence of standing stones. There's evidence of these stones throughout, including Malta, have very similar stones. And the reason why the ancients regarded these standing stones, and this is what we see at Göbekli Tepe. These stones at Göbekli Tepe were found in situ. Now, some of them had broken and fallen down, but the two standing stones in enclosure D that we're talking about were discovered in situ in the original context. This is how they were. They had little footings. They were carved out into the limestone bedrock, and then they were placed as one monolithic structure, still standing upright. So they're in situ. And so we see that these ancient standing stones throughout history were always to do one of two things. They were to mark the grave of that person who had died, and two, they were to venerate their ancestors. So they've done at least one or two things with this. They've marked the person's grave with it, and they have venerated their ancestors with these standing stones. And so in a lot of cases, we have megalithic standing stones that have another rock placed over on top of them for a covering, and we see this in evidence even in Israel, in countries surrounding Israel, in the ancient Near East, and in other places, even in Europe, these dolmens, where it was a burial site. But again, they were to mark an area, but they were also to venerate the ancestors. And so this is why we see evidence of these standing stones throughout history. And then we have an archaeological marker going to about 2000 BC that the Amorites practiced. It was a ceremony called the Kipsum, and they would, every month, they would pull out their dead ancestor, and they would give them ceremonial food and drink. Now, they would put real food, real water before them in a ceremonial way, and you would spend time with, your great grandmother, perhaps, and or grandfather, in that ceremony called the Kipsum once a month, and then you would put them back under the floor, where they were buried in the floor of your home. So we see this is one of the first archaeological markers of the veneration of ancestors. But this is exactly, I think, what we're also seeing at Göbekli Tepe is veneration of ancestor worship.
Yeah, thank you for that explanation. I just want to say, as someone coming from Eastern Europe as a Slav, we also have this very ancient ceremony where you will go to the grave of the deceased person, bringing food and liquid, usually alcohol, for the soul of the dead person. Also, when I went to this Buddhist restaurant here in the city, and I noticed, certain red liquid, which I don't think it was alcohol. and food crumbs left in the corner. And I asked the lady who is the owner, what is the thing with this thing, with those food and liquid left in the corner? She said, well, that's to appease the souls of our ancestors, for them as Buddhists. So for me, I see all this resembling, theme in so many ancient cultures throughout all the continents, or almost all the continents, where the ancients used to be in some way try to be appeased or feared of, or like, oh, even though your body left, but your soul, your spirit is still with us. Or maybe trying to ask them, hey, grandpa or father, mom, bless me, protect me, help me for something, and I'll appease you by giving you food and drink. So it's so interesting how, even before these cultures in Göbekli Tepe, they're basically doing a very similar thing.
Well, we see other cultures today still practicing this. The culture in Japan still does it. South and Central America, and they still practice, ancestor veneration or worship. They'll take the bodies out and take pictures with them, and so it's still being done today. So, but I didn't know that about the Buddhists. But it's not surprising. This has been going on for a long time.
And the last question, when it comes to these stones, what will be briefly said, the connection between the Anunnaki and the Sumerian pantheon and their relationship with Göbekli Tepe on all this religious significance of the pillars?
So the connection with the Anunnaki are those are the seven, going back to the seven sages or the seven gods who were, over the Sumerian pantheon, in the Sumerian culture. And this is exactly where we see the explosion of civilization after this. Most scholarship currently puts it at 4000 BC, but you have an explosion of culture that suddenly springs up with no evidence of evolution happening, cultural evolution happening. You have a sudden emergence of civilization with language, and with writing, and with pottery, and with design, community, agriculture, everything. Just a sudden explosion of it. So again, they had these seven gods in their pantheon, and at the very top of the pantheon was the god An, A-N, and An was a deity that they that was the sky god. And so, literally, when you break down the terminology in Sumerian, the A and An stands for father or for ancestor, and the N in Sumerian would be to raise or to lift up, or to be placed on the highest or in the highest. So literally, the god An, you were saying, was your father ancestor who we placed on the highest. So this was the very top of the pantheon of gods called An. And I think has a tie to Göbekli Tepe. And I won't get into all those details here, but there's a specific imagery that we're seeing at Göbekli Tepe that represents a cosmology that's very similar to the Sumerian cosmology. Now, I'm not saying it is Sumerian, but it's similar in context. And but again, if we go back and look at some of these things that we do know, I think there's evidence to show that there's some at least religious ties to Göbekli Tepe with these deities, and I think they specifically go back to these two pillars in enclosure D. But remember, they have deified the image of the moon, and they have deified the image of the bull. And we see in the region that at even places like Karahan Tepe, which is a neighboring spot to Göbekli Tepe, Jericho, who most biblical students would recognize, which is considered contemporaneous with Göbekli Tepe. The very name Jericho means worship of the moon god. We see that Abraham's father, who lived in the biblical town of Edessa, this is where modern day Shanlarfa is now, some 9 miles from Göbekli Tepe. They worship the moon god in that region. And in archaeology, we see a crescent standard, often flanked by 2 males, in reverence to this crescent standard. And then later on in Akkadian history, this moon god's name is identified as the name Sin. So it's pronounced Sin, but it's spelt S-I-N, as we would think of the word sin, but it's actually the god Sin. And this is exactly where we would find the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness of Sin for 40 years.
Thank you so much for that answer. Well, you already answered our outline number 4, so maybe Carey, you can switch to maybe number 5 in the outline. And I don't even know if Dr. Judkins has to dwell so much on the Luwian writing, because he already mentioned, but it's up to him and his timing.
I do want to ask, you mentioned that arms have to do with deity. Why would that be? Is that for protection's sake? Or like, we have God in the Bible with the outstretched arm.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that specifically, if it would be in regards to protection. It's a symbol of power and deity, and that may be a reason behind that is, the outstretched arm of the king or the ruling monarch or whoever it is would symbolize that power. Why? Because he's the guy in charge, right? He's providing everything. And in this case, it's representing deity status. And this is exactly what we see in the Ugaritic text. And so this is all referenced in the book with footnotes, and you can go back and follow those references and go back to the sources. A lot of the sources are secular scholarship sources that are not even biblical sources, but it helps us to understand, I think, a clearer picture of what we're seeing at Göbekli Tepe.
Well, and you also mentioned they did some hunting, and so they hunted the bull, the aurochs. What would the bull specifically be a symbol of as well?
So, yeah, they were hunting these auroch bulls. These bulls were quite large. The average size was they stood about 6 foot at the shoulder. So it'd take several dozen men to bring one of these down. I found a reference that said that they were, several feet taller, but that may not be the norm. I think the average size in the literature is 6 foot. There was one other reference that found one of these ancient auroch bulls that stood about 7 foot at the shoulder. But I have to retract a prior statement that I made, not here, but on another podcast, that they stood about 9 foot at the shoulder. That turns out probably not. And if it was, that was probably just maybe an isolated finding, but about 6 foot at the shoulder. But these creatures were big, and it probably took several dozen men to bring one of these creatures down. But that would provide a lot of food for your family, for your community. So we see evidence of them. I mean, there's a giant mural painted at Chattahoochee with one of these big bulls and several dozen men with spears bringing it down. So we know that they did that also at Göbekli Tepe.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So switching over to the language bit, how many people are going to agree with you that there is language at Göbekli Tepe?
This is a new theory. So when people want, they say, well, cite the sources, and this is a theory. It's a new theory, and it's an emerging theory. And I'm hopeful that scholarship and continued excavations at Göbekli Tepe, I think, and I'm predicting that there'll be more evidence of alluvial logograms at the site. There's not a lot of experts in alluvial language. There's not a lot of experts in alluvial history. There's not a lot known about that culture. It has not been very well studied because there's just not been a lot of archaeological context yet that's been discovered. But we do know that alluvians had a writing called logograms. We know that the Hittites adopted that particular language, and it was used for formal writing on monumental stone. Exactly what we see at Göbekli Tepe. They read and wrote in Sumerian, but for formal monumental writing on rock, probably for religious reasons, they wrote in logograms. Because a logogram is one word represents one idea. So if you have limited space, you would use logograms to write. And we see that this is not isolated. The Hittites adopted this into their culture, but at another site called Kara Tepe, not to be confused with Karahan Tepe, in 1943, they discovered alluvial logograms at that site. And it was classified as alluvian. So again, if this is alluvian, this pushes everything forward in time to the Bronze Age. That's why I'm suggesting that alluvian linguists look into the scholarship and the possible linguistic links at Göbekli Tepe, because I believe this is language, not art motifs. And if this is language, then it changes everything about what we know so far at Göbekli Tepe. So because this is a new emergent theory, I'm hopeful that over the coming years, that again, scholarship and the evidence will bear out that this is indeed language. And if it's language, it's going to change quite a bit of our understanding at Göbekli Tepe and the neighboring sites around the region. So I reserve the right to be wrong, because I'm not stating that this is a fact. I'm stating it's a theory, and it's based on circumstantial evidence. So there's nothing in the published literature that you're going to find, because this is a new thing. And I think over time, if my theory proves correct, and it's confirmed in scholarship and by alluvial linguists, and there's a handful of them out there. One of them lives in Chicago, incidentally. I think this is gonna be a game changer for Göbekli Tepe.
Well, that's exciting. I'm a big fan of new ideas and testing out theories like that, because it's the only way you're going to figure anything out. Do you have any examples? Well,
I was going to say science can only do two things, and it doesn't prove it. My goal is not to prove it. My goal is to confirm it. That's my hope, is to confirm the theory. And science through archaeology, can only do it in two ways. Well, it can do two things, two possibilities. One is it falsifies it, or two, it confirms it, or at least agrees with the theory until it gets confirmed. And so this is exactly, I think, what the next step should be. And the only way to really determine that is one, is have alluvial linguists look at the stones. The one in particularly is a stone at Göbekli Tepe, which is a very well-known alluvial logogram for Deus, which in Latin is transliterated to mean God. This is very clear. It's well-established fact. There's no debate about it. And this is exactly what we see on one of the stones at Göbekli Tepe, is the Luwian logogram for Deus on the stone. So I think this is a very important detail that needs to be investigated further in scholarship.
Very good. Yes, that's exciting, and it does change kind of that paradigm of this is prehistorical, we don't find any writing and all of that kind of thing. It helps immensely with dating once you have that kind of thing.
Yes.
Nika, did you want to go on to more of the iconography, or?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask one thing from the previous section. Maybe Dr. Judkins can spend a minute or two. Dr. Judkins, what would be the relationship between Göbekli Tepe and this location seen as a symbolic womb? You speak in this section about the relationship between Mountain Karaka and Eve or Isis, and I found this to be fascinating.
Yeah, it's too much to go into detail here, but in the book we lay out a case in the regeneration theory that at least when you're looking at enclosure D, that it could be a symbolic womb because of the beliefs in their cosmology. They believe that when your ancestor died, or when you died, when your loved one died, they would repatriate your skull back into the enclosure. So you don't need the whole body. You just take the skull. And this is why we see drill holes in some of the skull fragments at Göbekli Tepe. And I think it was there to suspend those skulls in the enclosure while you're performing these ceremonies. But that was to ensure that your loved one, when your loved one died, you went to the netherworld to die. It was a spiritual death that had to happen before you were spiritually reborn. So they equated everything of life and nature in regard to the afterlife. So the seasons of the harvest, the planting, and of course they didn't plant because that would be agriculture, but in the seasons of the harvest, where you would have the germination of the wheat and the barley, and then you would have the harvest, you would have the spring, and then you would have the harvest, and then winter, everything would die, right? Back until spring. And this is a more of a overall view of how they viewed their cosmology in the afterlife. So they believed that when you died, you actually went back to this death process, that you had to be destroyed, really, before you could be reborn. So the rebirth is being rebirthed spiritually, just like you would be born through your mother, right, through a natural birth, that there was a spiritual rebirth that had to happen. And so you went through a process of destruction, and this process of winter where there was death, and then you would be reborn back through your mother Eve, through the symbolic womb, back to the afterlife through your father ancestor, where you would be reborn back to the heavens as a star god. And they believed that, I think they were venerating constellations in the stars because they believed that's where their point of origin was from. So they have deified the stars, but they have venerated the constellations. And I think they specifically, because the imagery of the bull, they were venerating the constellation Taurus. And then right near that is the constellation Orion. And of course you have, in the eye of Taurus, you have the Pleiades there. So there's a lot of symbology in the afterlife regarding this. And this is exactly, I think, why we see the skull fragments at Göbekli Tepe, is because you were going through a ritual that your living relatives were performing, or your friends were performing on your behalf, so that they would ensure that you would be reborn back spiritually into eternity as a star god. And this is exactly where we see the very terminology of the word tumulus, T-U-M-U-L-U-S. This is exactly what we see and this is a protected covering in the grave or in a mound. And particularly in the ancient Sumerian, this goes back to the mound of An, which is pretty interesting in that symbology of the Sumerian pantheon, where in death you are placed inside an enclosure that was a tumulus, that was a protection for you in the afterlife, so you could get reborn back to the father ancestors, back to the stars. And so this is, I think, part of the regeneration theory at Göbekli Tepe, and the symbology of the symbolic womb is because in death they were ensuring back through the stones of your ancestors that you could be reborn back to the afterlife.
Very cool. Actually, it's a very Christian idea as well, like the grave as the womb and being reborn with resurrection.
This is why we wrote this book from a biblical perspective, because, again, a small but vital clue is those two anthropomorphic images that are wearing foxpelt loincloths. So I want you to think about that for a minute, because why would they portray these stone images wearing foxpelt loincloths to cover their nakedness? So you're right. This goes back to the imagery, but the imagery goes back to the actual event of what's happened back in the Garden of Eden.
Right. So I have, maybe this is a weird question, I don't know. So you have the incident at the Garden of Eden, right? You have the sin, and Eve is not named the mother of all living until after the sin happens, and that's connected to death, right? Do you think that has anything to do with this idea of womb and being reborn and regeneration and resurrection?
Yes. Yeah. We lay a foundation in the book so you understand how we get there. So we're not just pulling out some wild theory and throwing it out there. We're laying a foundation for it so you understand that by the time you get to the stones at Göbekli Tepe, you understand that there is evidence in ancient cultures for sacred goddess, mother goddess worship. There's a chapter in the book called Sacred Goddess, the Sacred Mother Goddess. It's in chapter 9, and we talk specifically about this because this is the deification specifically of Eve. And we know that cultures have they have deified. They deified Noah. They deified Moses. This is exactly why that there was a contention over Moses's body, because if the people would have got his body, they would have been prone to venerating and deifying him, his physical body. Later on, we see cultures deified him anyway, but you didn't have a body to go to. This is why there was that contention over Moses's body. We see that Nimrod was deified later. And then we see in Egyptian history that the Pharaoh becomes the living embodiment of deification. So no longer is it a king or being deified after death. The Pharaoh is a living deity, the living, breathing entity of God. And so it depended on what type of God they were worshiping at the time, whether Amun worship or Aten worship or whatever. But Hathor worship, we see this symbology of the cow with the crescent horns, and the imagery of the moon. So most of the time, symbols stay the same throughout cultures, and so this is exactly some of the same symbology, iconography we see at Göbekli Tepe.
Do you have any idea why they would have a fox pelts in particular as opposed to some other kind of creature?
Well, a fox pelt is pretty natural to cover yourself, So it's they probably used other animals, but in this particular case, they represented fox pelts for the thing. I think it's was just a natural, animal that they used to do that. So I don't know why they would have chosen that versus another kind of animal, but this is what they depict on the stones at Göbekli Tepe. So it's fascinating.
Okay. Last question when it comes to this symbolic womb and imagery of rebirth. Dr. Judkins, is this the reason why we see so many male figurines and phallic symbols? Are they related to this mother goddess Eve and rebirth and everything? I think we can see them all as one context or one image or one message, that through our ancestors, some sort of rebirth. I don't want to say necessarily reincarnation, but some sort of rebirth is happening, not just through Eve, but through also this figure of maybe not the Adam from Genesis, but some, the first ancestor, the first father.
Yeah, there's a lot of phallic imagery, ethiophalic imagery, not just at Göbekli Tepe, but around the region. Karahan Tepe and many others have this phallic imagery. But a lot of the phallic imagery is shown after death, which means it's a headless person, usually showing ribs, which indicates that this is an this is afterlife, which is a representation of death. And you have the ribs showing, the head not there. This is clearly someone who has died, but they're phallic, which means that it gets back to the regeneration theory of the person being reborn into the afterlife. And this is exactly why you see the phallic imagery, is because, again, it gets back to the very understanding of how they viewed life and their cosmology. And we see this in everything that they did, in the view of the sun and the moon, in the processions of the stars, the seasons, and the cycles of life and death that are represented, and between spring and autumn and the fall and the winter, etc. So this all goes back to the regeneration theory and the veneration of the ancestors. So when you died, you are ensured that you continued on in the afterlife. Now, it wasn't a reincarnation in the sense that you were reincarnated back into a physical, another physical person, but it was a rebirth back into a spiritual state where you were to live forever as a star god. And again, going back to the word tumulus, this is exactly what we find is this very meaning in Sumerian, and we detail it in the book, but their very meaning in Sumerian of the word is to create, in Sumerian, is to create a blazing or a shining star, to raise or to elevate in the mound of, again, in the very nature of the burial is to be buried or covered or protected in the mound of An. So this is, and in the symbolic womb of Eve, who was the only person who could recreate you. Why? Because the female could give birth. So it was a divination of the female through Eve that carried on the human line, but also could rebirth you in the afterlife.
Dr. Judkins, we're entering the last session of the episode by continuing talking about some further iconography and symbolism at Göbekli Tepe. This is probably my favorite symbol or depiction. I honestly didn't know that above the lamp, these represent serpents until I read the description. That was very helpful. So for me, this reminds me of Genesis 3. This reminds me of just so many passages throughout the Bible. We see the lamb or the ram, and we see serpents. Can you please tell us something about this imagery?
Well, like I said, only 5% of the Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. So we don't have a full understanding yet of the site until we get more excavations done. And but I think this iconography, this imagery that we see, in particular in reference to the serpents, foxes, scorpions, lions, these are all animals that can hurt you, bite you, sting you, kill you. And I think they're more representations of Holocene animals, which is right after the coming out of the Ice Age there. But these, I think, in a more broader context, these animals represent spirit guardians. And so you have the spirit guardian of the lion, the spirit guardian of the scorpion. You have others, including the serpents. These are all spirit animal guardians that would guard in the not only in the afterlife, but it would protect the people that were still living, because this was, again, representations of guardian spirits. And so you would appease these guardian spirits for continued harvest and grain and animals and things that you needed to live and survive on. You would need rain. So you would appease these spirit guardians to ensure that your God would continue to supply you with an abundant harvest and rain and things that you need. So I think these are representations of spirit guardians in these animals, but specifically in this, going back to the serpents there, these are spirit guardians of the serpents.
Okay, thank you for that. I just want to show to the audience a couple of other images of different animals. So here it says pillar 56 in enclosure H represents ducks, snakes, and a number of quadruped or four-legged animals, most likely felids, are portrayed in the upper part. Between these, large bird of prey can be spotted clutching a snake in its claws. And there's the whole segment of this article about the animals. On the left side, we see fox. Then we see in pillar 2, which is, that you already mentioned, a wild ancestor of domestic cattle. Then we see another fox and a crane on one of its broadsides. So we see that there are a lot of animals depicted in the whole site, and the whole site is, by the way, huge. There's so many of these pillars and so many images. If we could maybe summarize just when it comes to the animal imagery, besides the serpent and the lamb, what was, if there was any unifying motive for them to represent these animals? Was there any worship that maybe we're not aware of, or it would just resemble simply, the animals that were present in everyday life for our ancestors?
Well, it's hard to say for sure. I could only speculate. Again, I think that most of these animals are spirit guardian animals, but they were animals that I think that they saw, that they hunted, that they lived at the site or in the area, and they depicted them in various forms. We only talked about pillar 43 in the book, but there's various images in, I think, again, the imagery of the bull perhaps is, it was because, they were, it was one of their, one of the animals that they were surviving off of. But they at some point, they have deified this image of the bull. We see that again on Western Pillar 31 in the bull cranium. So the image of the bull and the skull and the horns in particular are noted throughout that region. Again, other neighboring sites, but especially at Çatalhöyük, we see this deification of the bull. So it's not a surprise that you'll find bull imagery throughout the region. Again, the people of the Neolithic were known as people of the bull. So, but these were animals that I think that were living contemporaneously with the people at Göbekli Tepe. And in most cases, they were able to hunt these animals, but they also served as guardian spirits. And the imagery of the birds, we talk about the imagery, the vulture in the book, and how that relates to the regeneration theory. Some of these other animals just may have been animals that were that they depicted from the normal, just everyday life, but they were representing things that they saw. And this is part of what we see, this zoomorphic imagery on the stones at Göbekli Tepe.
Okay, when it comes to animals, I think this is the last one for now. I haven't prepared to play a 5-minute video, but for the sake of time, we don't have to. I'll just summarize. Well, I was watching a podcast led by two Australian gentlemen. They were covering Göbekli Tepe partially in one of their episodes, and they showed the picture of a penguin, and supposedly penguin was the reason that why the further excavation have stopped at Göbekli Tepe. I don't know how true this is and how maybe a sort of a conspiracy that, some of the scholars said, to these gentlemen that, it could be that if penguin was, if penguin was truly portrayed on an image, maybe they'll have to, change their, I don't know, history books and things of that sort, and that doesn't always pay off. Maybe they'll have to go and do so many changes when it comes to textbooks and things of that sort. So it is said that once when they found this image, they stopped with excavation. I don't know what is true, what is not, but I was just wondering if you know anything about the so-called penguin.
I think it's speculative to call it a penguin. We don't know for sure what it is, so no one can say exactly what it is until we get more empirical evidence coming out of the stones at Göbekli Tepe. It could be a penguin. And if it is, I wouldn't be surprised. We are, just, 300 miles or so from Mount Ararat, where, the Ark landed on the mountains of Ararat, and this is generations later. But I wouldn't be surprised if, something like that was found. We just don't know what it is for sure. But look, even if it turns out to be a penguin, it's not going to stop excavations at Göbekli Tepe. That part I think is wrong. And I know there's been a lot of speculation about this recently, that they have stopped excavations. I've heard it because they had planted the trees and they stopped excavations, and they didn't want anyone to find any more evidence of XYZ, or this is the first one I've heard about the penguin, but that wouldn't stop excavations there. The excavations have slowed down, but they have not stopped, and they're just slowing it down for various reasons. But one is that they have to publish on a lot of this, which they can't continue excavations and publish. They have to slow down a little bit and get caught up. That's why information is very slow coming out of the site and published research. So there was a video some 4 or 5 months ago that Dr. Lee Clare came out. He's the director of the site from the German Institute of Archaeology. It's a video that you can search on YouTube. It's just called an update on Göbekli Tepe or something to that nature with Dr. Lee Clare. And I watched that video when it first came out, and he confirmed that they were not stopping excavations. They may be slowing down, but they're not stopping. And that's right directly from the director of the site. So I would just point people there to that as a reference for that interview with him directly, and maybe that will answer some of your questions about what's happening there at the site. But I've said this publicly before. I'll say it again. I think they're doing a great job. I know there's been a lot of speculation about things, about the walkways and parking lots being built in there, but I think they're doing what they can to preserve the site, to get the information out of the site, whatever that is, and to continue the excavations. Now, look, at the current rate, and before they slow down, it would take 100 or 150 years to fully excavate that 20 acre site. So I don't think they'll ever fully excavate it for those reasons. And certainly I'm not going to be around to see it in 100 or 150 years from now. But I think they're doing a wonderful job at the site, and they're doing what good scholarship and archaeology requires, and that's methodical excavations and letting the data speak for itself, and then putting out that data for the public to read. And of course, there's always going to be varying opinions and theories, but I hope that this particular theory of ours, in particular the regeneration theory and the linguistic theory, specifically getting to Luvian logograms, it's my hope that will bear out in the future excavations and through scholarship, that's what's happening at the site. And this is exactly why we decided after 5 years to publish, what we think is a new and emerging perspective on Göbekli Tepe.
Thank you so much. I have one last question, and then we'll be closing soon. If Carey also has any questions, she's free to ask after I'm done with this one. Dr. Judkins, for years there's been some conspiracies and theories among the ancient astronauts lovers and different mythology lovers. When they would see depiction like this, they were talking about the ancient people carrying these so-called handbags with them, but you actually use the word baskets. So can you please briefly just help us explain what is shown here on this iconography?
Yeah, I think these are not handbags. These are baskets, and they're carrying bundles of wheat. You can see the wheat coming out of the top and out of the bottoms. They're bundled, tied together. I think these are bundles of wheat in association with the vulture and the egg. This all goes back to the regeneration theory and the cycles of death and life and rebirth. And we get into all that in the book, but this is exactly what we see here on Pillar 43. The wheat has something to do with the life cycles. Matter of fact, the germination of wheat is exactly 9 months, which is the same as a human gestation and pregnancy. And we see the vulture, which we talk about, which is iconically related to this regeneration theory. And a lot of people speculated that's a human head. I don't think that's a head because we don't see it as a head. I think it's a cosmic egg, or an egg representing the rebirth of the individual back to the heavens. So we get into this more in detail in the book, but these are not in particular handbags. They're baskets, and they're baskets full of wheat here on Pillar 43.
Dr. Judkins, it's been a blast. I would invite once again all the audience members to please support and buy Dr. Judkins's and Dr. Burton's book. It got maximum reviews on Amazon. So bless the authors, bless yourself as the gift for this new season by learning when it comes to this ancient temple through somewhat different lenses, because we here have two Christian scholars who will be spending their passion, their time, their resources to research when it comes to this very important place of religious excavations and worship, so that it can help us as Bible students and Christians to see how did the ancients after the flood, how they spread out, how did they worship, how much they parallel the Bible, and how much they differed. So all of this will help us by studying from scholars like Dr. Judkins and Dr. Burton. Carey, do you have any concluding thoughts or any questions before we end with the episode?
Dr. Judkins, I'd like to know if you are planning more work about Göbekli Tepe or any other future projects that we can look forward to.
No, unless there's something major, another major find that comes out of Göbekli Tepe. This book took us 5 years to research and to write, and so nothing planned further, unless in future excavations there's more Luvian logograms that come forth, something major that we could update, maybe a second revised version, but for now there's no plans for that. I did upload an article to Academia, and if you want to read that about Göbekli Tepe, you're welcome to. It's I think a compliment to the book, and that'll help you understand, I think, more specifically in relation to the theories we've talked about tonight. Regarding anything in the future, we were hopeful to get to Göbekli Tepe and to do a big tour of Turkey. And that's been canceled a number of times for various reasons. We had the trip and itinerary greenlighted, and then we had to cancel. We were gearing. Quake happened, and then we were kind of gearing up to go again, and then the war in Israel broke out October 7th. And so for political reasons and tensions, we decided to wait. There are groups that are going now. I was offered to go, but it was through a tour, and it was cost prohibitive for me to do that. So eventually I'll get over there to the site and to Karahan Tepe and just go back to Turkey. My first and last only visit was in 2013 when I was there in eastern Turkey, climbing Mount Ararat in search for the Ark. But in regards to other plans, 2025 seems to be open right now. We have opportunities, but I have to kind of pick and choose and be careful about which things that I do. I'm self-supported. So that's a big roadblock in a way for me to be able to go and do things. If you would like to help support the work, you can go over to my site at aaronjudkins.com. And that's with 2 A's, AARON, aaronjudkins.com. And then there's a link to our new Patreon site. If you want to just go to patreon.com, it's under Ancient Pathways. I've got a lot of free content on there. If you love to read, I've got a section there called the documents, and they're all free PDF downloads. And you can download any one of those or all of them for your personal library. I have a lot of free content regarding podcasts and videos and things. There are some paid content there, or for members who just want to simply offer a $5 a month membership, you could get access to a lot of those things there. But we have made a lot of that content for free membership. But we don't have a lot of paid members. And so and it's rather new, but we would ask that if you could just buy us a cup of coffee a month, that'd be great. If you go over to Substack, I do have a new Substack account. It's under my name, Dr. Aaron Judkins, over at Substack. And I have a lot of content now there that I'm building on. A few of it is membership only access, because these are some articles and things that have taken time read, or to research and to write. They're referenced and footnoted. And so because of that, there is a membership access only for those articles and content. But and then I just simply have a donation tab up at my site if you want to just simply give and donate just to support the cause. But mostly I've done all this self-funded. Very few projects have been funded. The one in Turkey was. The one in Peru was with a work that I did with L.A. Marzulli on the elongated skulls, on the Paracas skulls. But you can find all my work linked up at my site, aaronjudkins.com. And of course, the book is live up on Amazon right now. We ask if you get a copy of the book and you enjoyed it, you learned something, that you go back and write us a review on Amazon. That really helps the book in the algorithm of Amazon. It ran #1 in new release in archaeology and #1 in new release in prehistory. And so we ask that if you did enjoy the book, you pass it on to a friend or someone that would enjoy it as well, but go back and write us a review. That would really help us out.
Very good. Thank you. And appreciate your joining us tonight and talking with us about this. So you got turned on to Göbekli Tepe from one of your followers. So if people follow you and ask you more questions, maybe they'll get you to go and do other things too.
Yeah, I probably would have never done that had it not been for the prompting of Roger from Canada. And what I thought I had known about Göbekli Tepe, my assumptions were wrong. And matter of fact, someone had asked me, what about, is that a belt on that stone? And I said, that's not a belt. It kind of looks like it, but it's not. There's a lot of things on stone that look like something, but it's not. But I had to eat crow on that one as well. I was wrong about that. And when I realized the implications of those two anthropomorphic images in Enclosure D, those 18.5-foot tall statues, stone T-pillars, that really intrigued me to dig more. And then that's when I discovered the Anatolian hieroglyphics on the stones, and this, this whole thing started developing. But look, there was no central place where you could go get this information. I had to get a nugget here and a little one over here, and then months went by for nothing. And then I then found something over here, and I began piecing all this together painstakingly, so over years of time. And there was just no one single source that put any of this together. And this is why we put it in a book called Decoding Gobekli Tepe, Biblical Anatolia and the Watchers. Now it's all in one convenient book. And I would ask for you to follow the references and the footnotes in the book, because that's really the depth and the breadth of the research behind the book. And it really is the bare bones to the foundation of understanding the theories that I'm proposing in the book.
Well, thank you for this couple of hours, Dr. Judkins. I just wish Dr. Burton was here so I could have asked him about his book on lycanthropy and werewolves that he announced a few years ago. I was like, when is the book coming? I want to get it. But I don't know if you have any info that you're allowed to share about that book.
Well, just continue to pray for Dr. Burton. I don't know what other current work he's got going, but he's had some health issues that have been pressing and ongoing, and he definitely needs your prayers. And he's got some wonderful people that follow his work, and they're very responsive. But we ask that if you're not familiar with Dr. Burton, get a copy of the book. He's got content in the book that he contributed to, and go over to his website, which is burtonbeyond.net, burtonbeyond.net. And he's actually got courses that he offers in various courses in mythology and the ancient Near East and Mesopotamia, etc., that he does offer and that he teaches. So that may be of interest to you. He's got other books that he's written as well that may be of interest to you. But it's a collaborative work that's taken years to write and to put all this together in one volume. We're just so excited to get it out to the reader and to people who are interested in biblical history or archaeology, or just in the site in general of Göbekli Tepe. I think we are presenting some very rational new theories about the site, and the implications of those, I think, are going to be staggering.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Many prayers and blessings to you and Dr. Burton. And I like quoting him when he says, Godspeed in your future work. May both of you be even more fruitful for the Lord. May God heal him, and may God bless and help both of you financially when it comes to your future projects. Maybe we'll do some episode in the future again on some other topic. But from the bottom of my heart, thank you once again. Have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.
Thank both of y'all. Thank you so much. God bless.